Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. My name is Tom Sard. Today, we're going to be talking about another new scientist. This one is from the Soviet Union. Um, his name is Alexander Luria. Luria. Quite famous. He was born, obviously, in Russia, and his very smart from the beginning. His dad was a professor. His mom was a dentist, both doctors, um, and they were also Jewish. The as And he was born in um, 1902, and obviously went through World War One and then World War Two as well. And that is how a lot of his work, or his work, was working with brain injury in not so much World War One, but World War Two, and learned an awful lot about what we call TBI, but shell-shocked people, obviously brain injured people, service people. So that's really how it all got started. Um, he also, based on his work, also ended up meeting another one quite famous is Lev Vygotsky. That's the next article after this one. They met. Len was a little bit older than Alexander. However, Alexander became a student of Lev. So we'll talk about Lev at the next one. But they came very close together, and he ended up working together in something that was called the Vygotsky-Luria Circle. So just a group of psychologists and philologist people working together. But during World War II, Luria was very prolific when it came to his work and his writing. And even through World War II, he was doing a lot of writing as well, and ended up writing something called traumatic aphasia. So obviously learned an awful lot about aphasia along the way, and how what we know today when it comes to a stroke and aphasia, same thing was happening with other people who had brain injury and also had aphasia. So he wrote about that in 1947, right after the war. Um, I'll say good and bad. Of course, he wrote it in Russian, and it wasn't translated and then published until the 70s, which is really amazing, given that all that work is almost 100 years. 50 years from the time he was born till the time it was finally translated long after World War II. And like many of the scientists, he lived a long life too, didn't die until 1977, and was working until the end. He was only 75. So it is amazing that we have learned a lot of people in the world of stroke and aphasia in the United States from Luria going forward. Two of his most famous books, and I'll talk a little bit about them. The first one is Higher Cortical Functions in Man. I really should have brought the book so you could see it. Let me get that. Sorry to do this for you, but I forgot, working on the next article. Now let me put this back on the shelf. This is the Higher Cortical Functions in Man. You get to see how big it is. And the other one is The Working Brain. And since I had my stroke and aphasia, and I told you before, I couldn't read, but by then I was at least going online and asking the questions of stroke, aphasia, Broca's area. And as a result of at least seeing the title of the words in the articles of which I couldn't read, I started printing them and looking at the title. And then, because I printed them, then I would look for words I could understand, look for words I needed to learn more about, looking for scientific knowledge, information, as well as the scientists themselves, and eventually, and then highlight them and highlight them, and saw Luria was part of this process, and started buying these books because I figured then the next thing I need to do is look at the table of contents and see what it said, because I could understand, like I've said before, 1 word, 2 words, 3 words, and then obviously another year or two, then I could read whole sentences, paragraphs, get more difficult when it gets to be bigger. But by then I'd bought the books and was pushing my way through understanding how some of these incredibly big books can be learned from a person who couldn't read sentences at the beginning. So I have had this for a long time. I've been reading sections of it for a long time as well going forward. But those two, the big one and they end up being somewhat of a pair, even though one was written in 62 and the other in 73. 73 is when I graduated from college. And this here for him, he's just a couple years before he passed. But a lot of his work was working with, and I say here, analyzing the disturbances of higher mental functions caused by injury and strokes and lesions of all kinds of things, and how that impacted their ability to work in the real world with reading, writing, and speaking. The second book, The Working Brain, as I say, it's more of a pair. It really, you read the first and you read the second, you can understand how it works. The second one was taking the sort of the next step and looking at, what I say here, the internal structure of mental activity, and the neuropsychological research that he had been working on. So that's what the two of them did. And obviously, large sections talking about aphasia as well, because stroke and aphasia is, of course, how an awful lot of the deficits that come from a stroke ends up with aphasia as well, given that 30 to 40% of people from a stroke also have aphasia. But as Luria was working forward, he was also reviewing previous scientists ahead of him, and beginning to understand from his perspective as well as others like Hewlin Jackson, who you've read his material from me a couple of months ago, where Jackson also was finding it difficult to understand why, not just because, but I'll use that word, just because Broca and what turned out to be Broca's area clearly became what we now know is the language center, assuming that when there's damage to our language, it all came from one place or another. And in the case of the Broca's area, obviously damage there, and assuming that that is where everything was, that the processed language. And it was Jackson who first started writing about the fact that it can't be just built in this one little part of the brain that launches and continues with language just from that one little piece. And what became, I said it in the article here, the controversy over localization versus function. Because as much as there can be any number of localization, like we call the language center, and if there's damage there, then it damaged the language. That's not to say that the function of the language isn't dispersed throughout the brain. And that was where the controversy started. And it's also part of what Luria talked about, is this crisis of that exact thing, where after Broca, there were many centers. I say imagine centers with functional maps, with centers for concept, writing, mathematical calculations, reading, orientation in space, and other things, assuming that because they thought they had found certain places in the brain that were organized around one part or another, and that's where it all came from. And that is what Jackson talked about, and it's what Luria now has wrote more about it too. as Jackson said, a quote here, approaching from the standpoint of the language of their construction rather than just of their localization in particular areas of the brain. As he said, whilst I believe that the hinder part of the left frontal convolution, that's the folds, and obviously he's talking about the Broca's area, is the part most often damaged, I do not localize speech in any such small part of the brain. To locate the damage which destroys a speech and to localize speech are two different things. That's Jackson. And now 100 years later is now in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, Luria talking about the fact that that localization and the understanding of that has to be completely changed. As Luria says here, those systems cannot be localized in narrow zones of the cortex or in isolated cell groups, but must be organized in systems of concertedly working zones, each of which performs its role in complex functional systems, and which may be located in completely different and often far distant areas of the brain. This is Luria talking there. And he concludes with that the essential apparatus of the brain for organizing intellectual activity as the whole. So coming to the understanding that when people used to talk about only 20% of the brain is working to do any other things. No, 100% is working all the time, and it works constantly going forward. And the challenge that Jackson had thrown down before, again, if you remember Jackson, it took 50 years for people to really understand what it was he was trying to explain. And then you have Luria also took up that challenge and said that although, yes, we do have the Broca's area, and yes, there's a lot of damage in the left side in the area of the Broca's area, and it does destroy an awful lot of language because there are so many nerves there. That's not to say that the rest of our language and speech are dispersed throughout the brain and do what they do whenever there is a stimulus and then some immediate response to that stimulus. You still have to go through the stimulus, then the integration component that comes from Shirlington, and that takes time to basically think before it decides to go in one direction or another with the response. So as Luria ended up saying, is that the having found what he had found, it is obvious that the entire brain, the whole brain, it really is greater than the sum of its parts. So you can't have just one center or 10 centers or 15 centers and then say, oh, you put all those together, that becomes the brain. No, it requires the entire brain. And then it uses, as it says here, they are organized in systems that work hard together with all the other cells between here and there to make who we are today as humans, as thinking humans. So that is what has been happening with this track of scientists we've been talking about. This year we have 2 articles a month. We will have 24 articles by the end of December, so it's coming up close. And they've gone in history. So most of them, all of them, have started early and then moved forward. Some are right next to each other. But by the time you get to the end, you, meaning people with stroke and aphasia, as well as their speech therapist, can have a better understanding of just how difficult it is to understand how the brain works. Even today, it continues to be very difficult because you have to continue to learn and reinterpret the scientists who'd written about it 150 years ago, bringing you up to today. Not to say that everything has been the truth along the way, but there are bits and pieces of what was thought to be true that are not as true as you would like them to be now. So this is how it works to finally come to the part where we are today, where now we just have a much better understanding of just how powerful the brain is and how complex the brain is when it comes to how we think and how we come to understand how we learn. So this is Luria. I liked him a lot of great information, and I do appreciate that the brain really is greater than the sum of the parts of the centers of the brain. Nice to see everyone. Have a good summer. The fall is here, and the next article will come out in a week, and you'll be talking about Lev Vygotsky, who is the professor of one of Luria's, professor of Luria as a student. All right, take care of yourselves. See you soon. Bye.